In this opening presentation, I want to talk a bit about our long human story, which is a wonderful story taking on an added meaning in our time as more and more people are becoming aware of our significance as a cosmic species and as a planetary species. I think one thing we need is a human story to match the elegance of our cosmic and planetary story. And that's what I'm presenting in this presentation tonight. So we begin by looking at the material on this slide, which is the very narrow reference we have had for quite a while, and in many parts of the Anglican world, up to a few years ago, these dates of the world beginning 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, the world, never mind the human race, was taken with a very strange literalness, which lasted till about the middle of the 20th century. And of course, unfortunately today, is still being accepted in many fundamentalist churches and religions. And that's the kind of material that we need to move beyond. I want to begin the long human story in the year 1959, in which two anthropologists, Mary and Louis Leakey, began their research in northwestern Tanzania. They found the remnants of a human skeleton, and it was mainly a skull, buried in a layer of rock, which I'll show you in a picture in a moment. They had a geologist working with them. The geologist claimed that the layer of rock was 2 million years old. And the Leakeys basically said that is impossible. So here were these two scientists who, in fact, unknown to themselves, were quite influenced by the prevailing thinking of the time that the human species was not that old, even though a number of important discoveries had already been made in South Africa and in parts of Asia. And in fact, when they wrote up their research, having eventually verified it with the opinion of a second geologist, none of the scientific journals would accept their account. It was in April 1964, 5 years after their initial discovery, that the first scientific article was published on their finding. So this is the Olduvai Gorge, and we can see it partly up along the side of the rock where people are climbing, and that's where the discovery was made. And you're seeing a picture of Mary and Louis Leakey as well there. Then things began to take off, but it was a good 10 or 15 years with this man Donald Johanson and his famous discovery of Lucy. And the outline of Lucy can still be seen today in the Scientific Museum in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. And that human origin, or that human artifact, has been dated at 3 million years ago. So you can now begin to see where the dates are being pushed back. And that's the material that I want to continue with for a moment. On this picture, you see two of the outstanding leading figures in the research today on human origins. To the right is Tim White from the University of Berkeley, and then Bernard Shaw, who is an African man, one of the first Africans to be trained in this research. And from their material, they, around the early 1990s, came up with a new date for human origins, namely 4.4 million years ago. And then we come to the final bit, which is the most recent dating of 7 million years. And the original research for this happened in the year 2000. With Michel Brunet, a Frenchman, and this young African man standing beside him, who was the one that actually discovered the skull. And I'll talk about that skull in a moment, because thanks to the wonders of modern science, what we can do even with something like that skull is quite amazing. It was found in Chad, in central North Africa, in a very remote area. They got permission from the Chadian government to take the skull out of the country. It was taken to the big laboratories of America and Europe, brought back in July of the following year, and then began a 6-year process of trying to date it. And they eventually, around 2007, agreed on a date of 7 million years. And that, to this day, is the date we're following for human origins. So this is our amazing long story, which as yet, and I'll be coming to this later, theologians and others are not embracing, which we need to do to see the full meaning of ourselves as human beings, and indeed the full meaning of what we mean by incarnation. Now this skull, this is an artist's impression of what our original ancestor would have looked like. I'm taking the liberty of calling it Lady Thumai, even though we don't really know whether it was male or female. It's generally assumed to be male. And through the detailed research, they've been able to come up with some significant features from that skull that indicate that in all probability it was human rather than pre-human or proto-human. So the position of the foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull, where the spinal cord enters, is similar to humans and differs significantly from pre-humans, suggesting that Thumai walked upright. And also Thumai has small canines or small teeth and large molars of a type not usually found in other members of the animal family or of the primate family, but distinctly in human beings. In all, there are 7 or 8 features that they were able to identify through this skull, which pretty much defines that it's human rather than pre-human. And that's the position that we're holding today. Now, there are basically 3 criteria that determine what makes us human rather than pre-human. And these 2 bits of terminology, Australopithecus, or the Australopithecines, and Homo. So Australopithecus basically means pre-human or proto-human rather than human, and Homo means human pretty much as we are today. For a lot of the scholars, they say it's a distinction we really shouldn't worry about, because the proto-human they're talking about here has all the potentials to become fully human in the sense that's important for us. So the 3 criteria: walking upright, and the evidence today for that is the one primarily around Thumai, that ancestor of 7 million years. Secondly, a particular size of skull, as the human skull is getting progressively smaller, around the 1400 cc, which is the present one. And then thirdly, the feature that I will be speaking extensively about in a second part of this presentation, the creative use of stonework, which is now going back 3.3 million years. Kenya is the country where a lot of this research has been going on for many years. Narakotime boy, discovered in 1984, was for quite a long time the primary evidence for Homo erectus, the human being standing upright. But as I've already said, we have moved fairly significantly now beyond that. The Leakey family are still around and continuing to work in the field, even though they would not be among the leading names anymore. And the most recent, Louise, got her PhD from London about 10 years ago and is now creating this new centre in the Turkana region of Africa, continuing the work particularly pioneered by her parents, Richard Leakey and Maeve. Then one has to say a word about South Africa, because research has been going on in South Africa since the 1920s. And today Lee Berger, who is one of the big names in South Africa, claims that their research is ahead of everywhere else. But the hard facts are that it's really what we're researching up in Ethiopia, in Kenya, and more recently in Chad, that is certainly outdating what they have been discovering in South Africa. So this is a cranium or a head of Sediba, discovered in 2008. And then more recently, in 2015, Homo naleda. And as you can see, this is a meticulous putting together of the skeleton of a human being from a vast range of bones. And just to give you a feeling of some of the excitement about this and the devotion to it, in order to get access to the material of this skeleton, he had to get a way of going into a number of very narrow underground caves, which he himself was unable to enter. So he got this group of young students from the local university, one of whom includes his own daughter, and they were able to creep in and extract and bring out the bones from which eventually the skeleton was created. It's a small little insight into the absolute dedication and devotion that goes with a lot of this work. So we come then to Homo ergaster, usually dated at around 1,800,000 years ago. It means the human being, the worker, the person who works. There are three important features around this ancestor. Number one, the more sophisticated use of stone tools. We think it might be the first hominid, the first ancestor, that began to use articulated speech, even though the substantial evidence for that comes much later. And also the beginnings of the building up of complex social relationships. This communal dimension has been a long part of our sacred story and something that has not been given due credit, and again is one of the features that shows a strong spiritual orientation in this entire story, which I will be developing later. So where is the evidence for a fundamental flaw is the question that's now beginning to come in. Because the more we explore this ancient story, the more it's our ancient creativity that we need to come to terms with as a species, instead of this preoccupation with the fundamental flaw, which unfortunately has been a major part of Christianity and has featured in other religions to one degree or another. This slide, which is some of the earliest evidence for the walking upright, is a set of footprints discovered by Mary Leakey, and they were dated by laboratories in both America and in Africa back in the late 1970s to have been originally made around 3.7 million years ago. Again, these dates are quite profound. We come then to ourselves pretty much as we are today. Homo sapiens, the wise person, and the person confidently showing themselves and portraying themselves with this wisdom. Again, this kind of healthy self-image I think is quite important in contrast to this emphasis on the fundamental flaw and the kind of degrading of human autonomy and dignity, which unfortunately has been so much part of that more negative view over the years. Again, the evidence is being pushed back all the time, and as of June 2017, we're now dating Homo sapiens at around 300,000 years ago. Up to that time, it was somewhere we thought between 150,000 and 200,000. Moving on then, we come to the Neanderthals, long considered to be brutish, primitive, robust and powerful. They've been around since maybe 150,000 years ago, and then became extinct quite suddenly sometime between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago. Again, the more recent evidence shows an ability to plan ahead, complex social networking, technological innovation, flexibility for what was often, we think, a difficult environment, particularly with weather influences, use of symbolism, ritual skills, particularly around the burying of the dead. That's an important one. And possibly the beginnings of language in the more formal sense. Now, we come to the scene of Africa. Oops, stop. Okay, sorry. Can we pick it up there from where I was? Something got stuck here. Okay. We come now to this slide. So one of the major challenges facing us as a human species today is that most of our sacred story, the story in which our God is co-creating with us and for us, has been happening in Africa for most of the time. Africa is our collective home as a species. We all know what it means to look after a home. We all like to try and keep our home in good shape. Collectively, our home today is in a terrible mess. And no matter how prosperous our things may be for us in other parts of the world, while our home is in the state it's in, as a species we're going to be feeling alienation of one type or another. So we have a very strong responsibility to try and sort things out in our home. That's a challenge politically, economically, and I also want to add theologically. And that's my particular interest in all this. So on this map you see the various areas in which we have been doing the research, beginning down here around Kenya and Tanzania, up into Ethiopia, and then eventually up into Chad. Meanwhile, the research that was going on and still is going on in South Africa, and I'm told today that the scholars are even moving further west into Africa, exploring the possibilities in other parts of that planet. Young Prince Harry has had a long link with Africa, and he says Africa is the place where I feel more like myself than anywhere else in the world. I have this love of Africa that will never disappear, and I hope it carries on with my children as well. So what I'm looking at here really is a presentation of anthropology with big implications for spirituality and eventually for theology. And it's the link with those sciences that I'm trying to develop and promote. I think theology and spirituality will be all the richer when we begin to make those connections. So Sally McFaig, who is actually a theologian, says, the heart of the matter is anthropology. Who we think we are in the scheme of things, where we believe we are whether we believe we are merely single individuals who live by and for our own wits and powers, or whether we see life as a gift from God and from all others on the earth. So, as I move towards the end of the presentation then, I want to pick up this quotation from Marianne Williamson. In a sense, it brings us right into the sacredness of the human condition and the human person, and lays the foundations for using this material as an integral part of our theology of the human person, or of incarnation, which will follow in a second presentation. She says, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. The words are often associated with Nelson Mandela. Indeed, he did quote these words at his 2 inaugural speeches, but the quotation belongs to this woman, not to him. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. And for me, this is the spirituality that's already emerging from this powerful story, this profoundly sacred story that sadly many people are still disconnected with, and that we need to connect with anew.